And welcome again. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to the workshops. Thank you for coming again. After lunch, afternoons are almost difficult, but we'll try to make it a little light and interactive. So let me just bring up my screens here and then we'll get started.
Okay, so by the time Tathagat gets his screen, so we just thought that as a chair, I think Hara and I have to welcome the speaker. So thank you, Tathagat. And you also have a very interesting session. So I look forward to being actively learning from it. And I think as a conference, I think first two sessions have gone exceedingly well. I think the credit goes to the entire community. I think it is good. So Hara, why don't you have, I think, a very personalized introduction of the targets to the audience? And thank you, audience.
In fact, Tathagat introduction takes a very long time, but I'll keep it short. He's a very rare combination of industry and academic orientation. He's played all the senior roles, but deep in heart, he comes from a teaching family, and so he holds it very close to his heart. And I have attended multiple sessions, and he actually does amazing job in terms of he's been a big favorite and big draw amongst the audience in various diverse set of events. That is another important thing. Having depth in multiple areas is absolutely joy. I'm looking forward to this, the most, what you say, interesting as well as difficult topic, AI first. Tathagat, welcome and thanks for putting it together for us.
Thanks, Hara. Thanks for a very generous introduction, and thanks, Professor Satgopan, for introducing me. And I'm very excited to present this session next couple of hours on AI first phenomena. By way of introduction, I work in my day job at Walmart Global Tech. I head the strategy and operations, and I'm also pursuing my EFPM program, which is equivalent to the PhD at Indian School of Business. This topic is very close to what I am actually pursuing. So you want to use this opportunity to share some of those ideas that I'm personally very fascinated about, and I'm finding it very interesting. And I also want to reach out to all the attendees on this workshop to also collaborate further. If they have any ideas or suggestions, I would love to hear back from them. So with that, we'll get started. And what I have done is, of course, these are my personal views, got nothing to do with my employer. And also, it's based on the research that I'm currently undertaking. And as such, they are liable to change because these are some of the ideas that are being subjected to various levels of scrutiny and various levels of validation. So I would certainly not hold them as the final ideas here. What I have done broadly is that for the workshop, I'm looking at three high-level sort of sections. And what I'll do is we'll take a short pause after each one of them to basically do a reflection on them. Because a workshop in a webinar, in a Zoom kind of a setting is slightly difficult because the interactivity gets lost. But I definitely want to invite you for sharing your perspectives and sharing your ideas and even criticism during the time of reflection. So those are that would be my request to everyone. In terms of topics, we'll cover a little bit about how does the AI economics really vary compared to, especially compared to the software that we are so used to. And surprisingly, whenever we talk of AI, we don't always, the whole simile of software doesn't always come to mind of a lot of people. But we'll try and tease out what are some of the similarity and differences between software versus AI. Second, we'll talk about some of the things that I'm beginning to call as cognitive chasms. And I've taken basically the leaf out of Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm book, where he had talked about how when he looked at the Everett Rogers diffusion of innovation curve, he found that there were two big chasms there where the adoption doesn't go very seamlessly, especially for the high-tech goods in B2B, which was his original research area. And he built the theory around crossing the chasm. What I've done is I've taken that sort of a playbook and extended it, because in the AI adoption, I'm seeing there is a similar kind of chasms that we are seeing, and at many levels there are those drop-offs that are happening there. So I'm trying to build some explanation around what's happening there, and I would like to present the same in the second module. And finally, in the third module, the whole phenomena of AI first, which has been a fairly new phenomena. I think the first time it was used was by Sundar Pichai, the Google CEO, in 2016. So it's only about 5 years that we have started to really hear of this term. And hence there is no clarity, no uniformity, no one single definition of what does it even mean. Last year, the first book on this by the name AI First came out by Ash Fontana, and that's the only book that is there at this point in time. But I'm trying to, from my own literature survey and research, I'm trying to put together a framework to explain what does AI first really mean. So I would like to present it to all of you. So that's the third and the concluding part of it. We hope to wrap up by 4, so we'll get started on that. Now, just to set the context, when we look at artificial intelligence, there are all kind of things that come to the minds of people. While there are a lot of people in the tech sector who are very excited with the opportunities with that, in the business, it's a little more guarded. Yes, on one end, there are people who are looking forward to the possibilities that open up when you think of AI in the midst of your organization. But then there are some people who are also on the careful side of it and saying, we are not quite sure if it's the right thing for us to do. And then at the societal end of the spectrum, you see there is even more kind of a guarded silence or guarded voice, in terms of people are very vociferous at times and saying, no, it is not good for it. I mean, people like Stephen Hawking were extremely critical of artificial intelligence. And then, for example, people like Elon Musk are also saying that it's an existential risk to the human civilization. But a lot of other people seem to be on the side where they are eagerly looking forward to it. So what is really happening there? And that's some of the things that we'll try to talk about in this. Well, whether we believe in it or not, or whichever side of the spectrum we are in, artificial intelligence is already around us. In fact, one of the joke among computer scientists is that artificial intelligence is something that cannot be done today. Like Andrew Ng, he actually says, for some reason, people always seem to have this whole notion that artificial intelligence is in the future. But we don't realize that there is already so much of artificial intelligence in the present itself, which is all around us, whether it's a smart home, whether we use software, for example, the Google Suite, or we use the smart assistants or e-commerce, or even our smartphone in the pocket. There is so much of artificial intelligence, at least as a generic technology, that's already there. And the projection is that by end of this decade, it's going to be a $15 trillion economy all over the globe. So there is a huge amount of interest that how can it really create such kind of an economic windfall just in the next 8 to 10 years. Because this by itself, and then in in fact, Niti Aayog's estimation is that by 2035, it will contribute to $1 trillion just to the Indian economy itself. So there is clearly a lot of anticipation about the economic potential of AI. Now, this whole impact of $15 trillion is actually going to result in almost 14% higher GDP by 2030. And it's expected to come from increased productivity. So about 6 trillion is going to come from increase in the labor productivity. And another 9 trillion is going to come from the consumption side effects there. So we'll try and understand a little more about what does it really mean. And for some of the local economies, it could be as much as 26% boost by 2030. So clearly there is a lot of opportunity at stake, and this by itself is probably going to be among the single most impactful development in this decade. Now, the labor productivity itself is looking to augment the productivity of labor force. So it could be automating some of the tasks and roles, and then also looking at the product enhancements and also increased demand for products and services, because AI is going to create more variety there. So those are some of the ways in which the economic value will be added. So let's kind of just a very short, just roll back the tape and see, okay, so that we are all on the same page. What is really artificial intelligence? Well, the goals of artificial intelligence, as it started as a discipline back in Dartmouth Conference in 1956, have changed to some extent. We are not really talking about understanding how for example we can have the computer perform like a human brain. But we have come to the agreement that okay, if it looks like it's like the duck analogy. If it looks like duck, talks like duck, then it's probably a duck. So what we are saying is if it can mimic, if it can imitate the way human beings operate, or the way human beings solve some of these problems, and that we call as intelligence, then maybe we can also call the whole field as artificial intelligence. We can call those computers as artificial intelligence agents, for example. And so irrespective of how it is kind of happening under the hood, because as we will see, a lot of machine learning today is really the statistical inference, and it is not it's exactly the same as, for example, aeroplanes do not fly like birds. Now birds fly by actually flapping their wings, but aeroplanes do not really fly like that. Aeroplanes they still follow the same laws of for example, the aerodynamics work, but they don't fly like birds. So we only can make an intelligent guess looking at how the neurons and how our human brain operates. We don't know for sure really, for example, how does a sentence really get stored inside the brain. And hence, when a deep learning algorithm is really looking at how it is kind of constructing a sentence, we cannot really say that that is not how the brain works. But we are saying that because it behaves like how a human operates, it is an artificially intelligent agent. So that is the kind of a working definition that for now we can go ahead with. And machine learning by itself is a lot of times we are using these terms in the industry: artificial intelligence, machine learning, even data science, sometimes even analytics. A lot of these terms are very close to each other, but machine learning is the closest to what we are really doing today, where we are actually creating the software that focuses on using data and algorithms to imitate the way humans learn and gradually improve it. So that's really the whole idea, and predominantly using the statistical methods. And these algorithms are essentially making classifications or culling out the patterns from the data. And so if there is a range of data, they are culling out the patterns from inside the range so that they can predict outside the range what is going to happen. That is really the essence of it. And whether we look at it from a image recognition, whether we look at it from natural language processing, any of those things, essentially what we are trying to do in a machine learning context is that from within the range, we try to cull out the pattern and then estimate out of the range what will be the prediction there. Deep learning is slightly different because it is using a different kind of algorithms under the hood. And in fact, even the computer scientists themselves do not really understand how it works. What we do know is that it does represent internally those objects and the components of those objects in a mathematical way. But how does it really construct it, or how does it really store a particular, or how does it construct a sentence syntactically, is not something that is very well understood at this point in time. But let's park it for now, because this presentation and this workshop is really more on the business elements of it rather than looking at under the hood part of it, which is equally important, but focused probably for yet another conversation, which is really dwelling more into the technical areas there. And as I said, AI and ML are not really the same. Machine learning is really a subset of it, which is what predominantly we do today. But let's use AI as a generic term, which is what seems to be the practice in the industry. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize is that AI is just like software. It is basically the new software. It is a software 2.0 or the new software, whatever we want to call that. The key thing to remember is, in a traditional software development, we have been doing explicit programming. So the logic logic is known to the programmer, and the programmer codifies that logic into a given programming language, which is a formal language, so that it is a predictable behavior every time it is run, every time it can be tested, every time it can be its behavior can be assured there. So that is a big difference between how the software has been traditionally written versus what we are seeing how the software is being written in the context of AI. And if I have to just call out those differences, the reasoning pattern inside a traditional software is very deductive. So we know that if for example, if all men are mortal, Aristotle is a man, then Aristotle is mortal, right? I mean, that kind of a thinking there. Whereas when we are talking about AI software, it's inductive in nature. So we are looking at a pattern, and then we are looking at the effect now, and we have the data, and we are trying to sort of looking at the data, guesstimate what might have been the treatment, what might have been done there that led to the effect there. And the logic is not something that is manually pre-programmed. It is not like a finite state machine. It is not something that can be assured to reach a particular state given a set of inputs. It is programmed to automatically keep learning. So as it keeps learning, its behavior can change. Its behavior can be it's a probabilistic range in which it's going to give the answers. In fact, some of you might remember some years back, Microsoft had put out a chat bot on Twitter by the name Tay, and within 24 hours, Tay's behavior completely changed because it was subjected to so much of abuse on the Twitter that it started becoming a very racist kind of a chat bot. Now, that would not typically happen for a regular software, because a regular software is working within the bounded space of its input and its logic. Whereas when it comes to the AI software, any kind of a data could be something which is a very long tail of data, and it could actually have an impact on its behavior over a long period of time. So that's one thing that we need to understand. Solutions are more probabilistic with the AI software as compared to the traditional software, which is more deterministic in nature. And the consistency doesn't remain the same. The consistency at the positive side of it can improve with the usage of data, so that when we have more and more data in training, for example, and more data is available to give the feedback, its performance can improve. The model can learn from it. That is the core of artificial intelligence system, that it learns with the usage. But over a period of time, it can also degrade when there is a model drift or a data drift happening there, simply because it is getting the kind of a data that was not part of the initial design, for example. So, and the last point is, I think, very important for our discussion today, that the business model impact of it is, for a traditional software, we are looking at it a one-time development effort. So you predominantly have some sort of a logic, and you're codifying it. And then you are basically selling it. If you build a product like MS Office, you are selling it, and then you might keep having your maintenance and enhancement cycles. But that's really the business model, that you invest in R&D upfront, and then you are selling it. In case of an AI software, so far the business models that we have seen, and we'll talk about some of them, each project is a one-off project, and it requires a full lifecycle management mandatorily. So you cannot simply say, I built an AI software, I release it, and that's it. I don't need any data science people. I don't need any machine learning engineer. I don't need to monitor what's happening there. Everything has to be, it's almost a given at this point in time that it's a lifelong, as long as the AI system is in operation, each project will have to be continually manned and managed and monitored, so that we are monitoring some of the performance there. So that's a big difference, and that has a big bearing on the business models, because those same traditional business models don't lend themselves very well here. So what are the ideal problems that we can solve for using artificial intelligence? I just want to present two perspectives. One comes from Marco Casalina, and Marco is the head of Salesforce Einstein project. As some of you might know, Einstein is their artificial intelligence platform that Salesforce has built. And he gave a very interesting perspective in an HBR article where he said, can a human do it? Most of the time, AI cannot do anything that humans cannot do. And if they can, okay, maybe AI is a great way to take up the task off the human's plate to free them for other magical things. So the point he's making is that anything that humans can do can essentially be done by artificial intelligence today. And the whole idea is that we try to take off their plate so that they can focus on other value-added things there. And the AI guru Andrew Ng says it even better. He says, if a typical person can do a mental task with less than 1 second of thought, we can probably automate it using artificial intelligence either now or in near future. So I think he is also comparing it to the Daniel Kahneman's system 1, system 2 kind of a thinking, where if it's a system 1 kind of a problem where it's a very autonomic thinking of the brain, then this is something that where we can, with a reasonable amount of understanding, we can sort of create the rules or create some kind, or even from a machine learning point of view, describe it to a system so that the system can imitate that level of thinking. If it requires more than that, maybe there are other complex interactions that are happening which are not very well understood, or there might be, like, one of the term I like is the cognitive disambiguity. So it's not cognitive ambiguity. So it's not very clear how exactly I do, but I know how to do that. And maybe that's not the fit candidate for artificial intelligence today. So that's a kind of a context there. And then, as we know, not everything can be done by artificial intelligence. We still are learning. This is a very young field at this point in time. And like any other young field, it's going through its own maturation process to do that. So how does the economics of artificial intelligence really work out? Professor Ajay Agrawal has done some work on that, some of the books he has published on that, and I like some of the areas where he has talked about it. That one of I think his biggest point of view is that artificial intelligence, it essentially, at the core of it, it lowers the cost of prediction. And that's really the essence of what we are talking about here. So as a business, as a business function or as a business capability, prediction is a key capability. Unfortunately, before artificial intelligence, we have not looked at that prediction as a separate capability. We have always looked at prediction and judgment as a kind of an embedded capability, as a part of the managerial capabilities, for example. So as a manager, if everything could have been codified there, then we won't need managers. Maybe that's a perfect world or a utopian world, and it's not going to happen. So the managerial discretion, the managerial judgment, the managerial ability to discern between things is a very important part of being a manager. But what was kind of two things together. They were kind of working together. One was prediction, one was judgment. What people like Professor Ajay Agrawal have done is they have actually separated and untethered them and said prediction is really one part and judgment is the other part of it. And then he goes on to say that prediction is essentially, when it lowers the cost, multiple things happen. So one is we tend to use more of it. And I think in the last 5 or 10 years, we have seen that artificial intelligence, or at least the ability to predict, is literally everywhere. Whether it is people talking about what books to buy, your e-commerce site is telling it, or even when you do your search engine, it is already kind of predicting what you might be wanting to look at based on the past patterns of people. Or it might be able to recommend your favorite food from the nearby restaurant based on your eating habits in the past. Any of them is really the prediction, and because it is so cheaper now, we tend to use more of it. So that's the first point. The second point is that not only in the traditional use cases, but we also start using it in the non-traditional cases. So he gives a very good example of autonomous cars. In fact, the way he looks at it is, he says, look at autonomous cars. This has been a holy grail for last 20-30 years or even more, even before the AI really started picking up in a big way. But with the artificial intelligence algorithms being available, we have reframed the problem. It is not a driving problem anymore. It's a prediction problem. So what we are saying is that a car can either go left or go right or go fast or go stop, right? These are the only 4 mechanical movements possible for a car. But if you now take out the prediction capability and the action capability separately, then these are the 4 that become the action, and the prediction is like go left or go right. It is actually having to decide whether the object in front of it is a human being or it is a shadow, for example. And it has to decide whether it should continue or not. So what he says is that now that we are able to take a step back and we are able to reframe the problem, that self-driving or autonomous car is not a driving problem as much as it's a prediction problem. And because prediction is cheaper, we are able to use it in those areas. And finally, in the context of business models, he talks about the concept of complements and substitutes. And he says that when the cost of prediction is lower, it actually has an impact on really raising the value of complement. So the complement in this case is data. And that's the reason why economists called data is the new oil a few years back in its lead article. And then he calls out human judgment. So a lot of times people have a thinking that AI is going to replace humans, or AI is going to replace human judgment, human managers and so on. The point is that it might actually lower the cost of substitute, which in this case is human prediction, because we are not so good at prediction. We don't have the same ability because we cannot process more than 2 or 3 variables at a given time, whereas an artificial intelligence in the last year was the year where the models beyond GPT-3, they have gone to like almost 200 billion parameters or even more. So people are already talking about such huge monster models which can process so many hyperparameters, whereas the humans cannot really do that. So that cost of substitute is going down. We humans are going to go down as far as our value in the prediction game is concerned. But when it comes to the judgment game, Ajay Agarwal and his co-authors' hypothesis is that value will go up actually, because the prediction will be so cheap, but the action, whether we should really act on that or not, or this is the right timing or not, is something that's going to be driven largely by human judgment, and then the follow-up action by the organization. So that's, I think, a very interesting way to look at the economic impact of how artificial intelligence is. And as a very interesting thought experiment, he actually offers a very interesting idea. So he says, let us say your favorite e-commerce retailer, right? And your e-commerce company is, for example, maybe it gives you 20 recommendations. Let's say you go and buy a book, and then it gives a recommendation for 20 books. And he says, people who bought this also bought this. And his research says that people pick up typically just 1 out of 20. Now, 1 out of 20 looks bad enough, but then we should also remember that 20 has actually come out of maybe the millions of titles that they hold. So that itself is impressive enough. But then when it comes to presenting those prediction, we pick up only 5% of it. So 1 out of 20. And because the e-tailer doesn't really know which book you are going to put, they are going to wait for your order. So the business model today is that first you sell, then you ship, right? That's very clearly. So first they sell the book to you, then they ship it to you. Now, what he offers is that, for example, if this prediction accuracy goes up by, let us say, 2x or 3x or 5x, there will be some point where it will be probably that e-commerce company will be so confident that instead of 5%, they will have 40% confidence that if I offer 10 books to you, you will buy 4 books out of it. Are we simply going to look at it like an optimization problem at that point in time, or are we going to turn the business model on its head? And what he says is that instead of looking at first sell, then ship, maybe the business model can be changed to that you ship irrespective of it. Because you have so much of confidence in your 10 recommendation that 40% will be bought, you just ship all the 10 to your customers without even them asking for it. Because you have so much of confidence that they will pick up any 4 of them, and even taking the cost of return logistics for 6 out of them, you would still be in profit. Now imagine that's the kind of a business model, and that is the reason why when people talk about AI or digital transformation, what they don't understand is that AI is not there to only create those small tweaks here and there, but AI actually, when it gets embedded inside your value creation, it's going to completely change your business model and hence your economics as well. So I think that's a very interesting perspective of how the economics of AI can really have a upstream effect on how the firm operates itself, right? But unfortunately, it's still a far way to go. We are still working on some of these ideas. We still have a long journey there. It's not quite easy. Otherwise, a lot of companies would already be doing that today. We are clearly seeing that the nature of machine learning has a lot of long tail distributions, and the long tail distributions really lend itself to the problem that maybe it's the amount of time that you take to, let's say, get to a 90% or a 95% accuracy, the same amount of time, effort and money it might take for you to make another 5% improvement and then another 2% improvement. So it's kind of a sort of a increasing cost to get to the next delta, for example. So it's not an easy thing, and that's the reason why we are seeing a lot of failures, also a lot of development cost associated with artificial intelligence. So for example, let's say you have a facial recognition software. Now, based on the data that has been given, and one of the researchers at MIT, she actually did a lot of research on that. When she she's black skin tone. So when the facial recognition would not recognize her, or her white colleagues would recognize. System has been well trained on that with a very low false positive rate on that. But in this particular case, there was a very high level of rejection of that. It would not even register it actually. And when she researched it further, she found that well, there is a systematic bias happening in the training data itself there. And because it has become a long tail problem, the number of women of color, for example, is not really, it's more of a long tail distribution problem, and hence the machine learning algorithm cannot really give high prediction accuracy for that. So those are the things. And when, for example, if you go and put it out in the public domain, you cannot be guaranteed what's going to happen. And that was the example I was giving for the Microsoft chatbot Tay, that once it was in the public domain, you could not ring fence that and say only this kind of an input is available, other inputs will not go there. And interestingly, the last point in this module I want to offer is that technology itself is maturing. And very interestingly, while there is so much of excitement in the research world with artificial intelligence as a technology, when it comes to adoption in the business, I think there is a real chasm here that we are seeing here. For example, this author, Alexander Wisniewski, he actually analyzed all the core AI algorithms in the last 30 years. And what he found was that it takes on an average 18 years between the AI algorithm publishing and it being adopted in mainstream usage. So there is a big gap between them. And then, of course, data made it possible because, and even then, when the data was available, it still took 3 years there. So there is a real issue there. It has to take its own time to really mature in that sense. So on that one, I just want to take the last slide on the first module here. So essentially what we are seeing is that AI is really a new type of business itself. It is not even a new type of software. It's a new type of a business by itself. Something that we cannot do a linear extrapolation of a very old 20th century model and say, okay, this is how we understand the economic theory of the firm. This is how we understand the transaction cost. This is how we can extend that to the AI driven businesses. AI needs both software and services are the human labor component there. And in particular, 3 things that come out from is very interesting from A16Z, which is one of the leading venture capital firms, where they have a lot of thesis around what works in the AI in business. One is they tend to have lower gross margins. Unlike in software where the gross margins could be 80% or even higher, here the gross margins are only about 30% or 40%. And that is because while we are using the digital infrastructure like cloud, for example, what we don't realize is that long tail actually creates so much of data, so much of compute, that it actually consumes the cloud. So even in theory, we are saying that we are using cloud. The long tail of machine learning is what really leads to the heavy consumption in compute and cloud infrastructure. And that also leads to the scaling, because you have to have a lot of compute, storage, power available. And then in the morning session, Hara was talking about the moat. And here we have similar kind of a thing, that the moats that sometimes people think are very defensive, but they are not always defensive really, because the AI models tend to get very commoditized very rapidly. And then there are challenges with data network effects that they have talked about. So those are some of the challenges that they say are really the culprit there. So let me just pause here on the first segment. And I'll probably open up and invite reflections from everyone on this call. What is your understanding of AI? Does your organization have a clarity on what is the right problem to solve? And how do you really measure the success or eventually the ROI of your AI initiative? So if anyone would like to talk about it, please unmute yourself and welcome here.
Hi, can you hear me? My name is Krishnan.
Hi, Krishnan. Yes, I can hear you. Yes, please go ahead.
So I thought in the post-afternoon session, somebody has to set the ball rolling. So here I am with
Thanks
some
for
comments.
being the first.
So, thank you, Tathagat. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm Krishnan Narayanan. I co-founded a research think tank called Itihasa Research and Digital, and AI is one of the areas of interest for us.
Nice.
Yeah. So here is one question that there are 2 points that I'll make. One is privacy over recommendations. Do you foresee a world where there's of course nowadays so much pressure on privacy of individuals and giving choice to individuals, consent-driven architectures, and so on, right? So the fact that e-commerce companies today recommend, they didn't seek my permission actually before recommending these products, right, in the first place.
Right.
So imagine for a minute, consent-driven architectures became more and more popular, right?
Yes.
Like in financial transactions, consent-driven architecture is now accepted, but it's not yet accepted in the e-commerce world. But imagine since you're imagining situations, imagine in the future, privacy trumps the recommendations.
Right.
In which case, there will be implications on the AI accuracy or AI these things because they won't get all that data.
Correct.
So yeah. I'm just saying that it's not just.
So I think I think I get your point, Krishnan, and I think that's a very, very fair point here. I think we are clearly seeing the whole phenomena of if you are not paying, you are the product kind of
right.
thing, where obviously we are paying with our time and the data that the so-called emission data, right? We are going to multiple sites and we are leaving our breadcrumbs, and that is what they are culling out. Now, the flip side of that is while we are not having to pay any of that, the free element of that is that we are getting more accurate, more relevant recommendation. Tomorrow, that if the deal is off, that hey, I'm not really looking for it because I don't want to give you that kind of a access to my habits, then if I am willing to really be deprived of such kind of a more focused or more precise recommendation, then maybe that will become one business model where it will be on a best effort basis. And the challenge of that is that you might find a lot of noise to signal ratio and you might give up on that. Another kind of a business model that I foresee happening, which is very common now in the digital streaming, for example, where look at what happens on YouTube. You normally have a lot of ads. So if you are playing music on that, you get ads pre-roll and post-roll and those kind of ads there. Now, if you don't want to do that, then you have an option to take a subscription-based service, whether it is a Spotify or whether it is YouTube, and then you are done with the ads there. So I think the way I see that happening is that the cost of serving that, the infrastructure cost, the establishment cost, the IP cost, the content cost of YouTube or Spotify or any of them, they have to defray it one way or the other, because it cannot run as a free lunch. So obviously they have to find a business model that is sustainable. One way of them capturing that would be capturing the value would be really using a subscription based model so that they are still able to defray their expenses. Another way of doing it that would be that, okay, you don't want to pay subscription, that's fine, but then in the bargain, we are going to look at your behavior and we are going to do ads, because that is the way we can also monetize our platform from the advertisers. So I think I definitely see the what's going to happen is that people are going to pay for the privacy as a premium service. That definitely seems to be a very viable option there.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure, please.
Okay. So there was recently I came across a paper by Eric Bjornson, from Stanford, where I think they have analyzed the AI usage of AI in the context of a contact service.
Right.
This thing, and one of the interesting things they found was that the service agents who benefited the most were the less skilled service agents.
Right.
And so they seem to benefit more from the usage of AI like the productivity improvement as of course both productivity and like both efficiency and effectiveness. They measured
Sure.
both.
Sure.
Both the measures actually improved much more. So there was a disproportionate benefit given to lower skilled employees
Right.
in
Right.
that context. So I
Okay.
thought this was a very interesting.
Yeah.
This was a very interesting finding.
Yeah. No, I think. Yeah.
Because sorry, just to close that thing.
Sorry.
In the sense, I thought generally with other tools, the more skilled a person is, the better they are able to leverage the tools, much more efficiently. But here it seemed to be the other way around. So I'll stop here. I would love to hear your thoughts.
No, I think it's very similar to what I was quoting Andrew Ng's statement that if it can be done in less than 1 second, I think we can safely assume that something that can be done in less than 1 second is a very basic atomic skill, because there is not much cognitive traction required to really do that. It's kind of, it's almost like an if then else kind of a thing, the traditional expert system kind of a thing. So in those cases, I think it's a matter of really being able to look at a knowledge base or look at the customer records and being able to serve it. And that is something that the computers and the bots are really good at. Human beings might take some time, but if they are able to have an NLP interface and say, okay, I understood you are looking for your boarding pass. Here is your boarding pass, right? So I'm able to give it to you. So those are the kind of things where you are right, it will happen there. The only point I want to add to that, Krishna, is the cost part could be dramatically different there, because the man-machine economics in West versus the man-machine economics in India could be dramatically different. And the pattern that we might see in the emerging economies is that the medium income jobs are more at risk than the top end or the bottom end. Because the bottom end, what is happening is, even though what you said is very true, that those are very easy things to do, but the economics of that are not in favor of really let the algorithm do it, because maybe it costs you 10 times using a machine or a software. Whereas the medium ones, probably the economic balance is in the favor of machines. And the top ones are really those system 2 kind of problems, which probably cannot be done in the AI today. But I think those are still the things where we are kind of looking at that. But I'll just keep moving. I think Professor Sadgopan had a question. He has raised the hand.
Okay, so I'll just have a simple observation reacting Krishnan said. So Krishnan, I'll give you an actual use case. A couple of years back it happened. One philosophy professor, and one day he came and asked me, hey Shadagopan, I understand that Google Gmail reads all my mail. This is just terrible. I said, yes, sir, yes, that is the nature of the beast. And he said, look, they have not taken permission, etc., etc. We had some nice chat. And then about a week later, he came back and said, hey, Shadagopan, something interesting. Gmail does something really smart. I like it. I said, what? I was sending a mail back saying that, look, please find the attachment. And I forgot to send the attachment. And then Gmail immediately prompted, you forgot to send the attachment. Okay. Then it prompted me. Immediately I remembered, I pressed the button. It was a great help. So I kind of laughed. And then he said, why are you laughing? He said, look, professor, you said Google reading the mail and you objected. Without reading the mail, how did the mail know that you have forgotten to add the attachment?
Right. Yeah.
You get the point, right? So what happens is sometimes we are actually happy if certain things happen, right? But at a philosophical level, we find it very difficult to accept that the machine is reading.
Right.
Right. And I think if it is something which suits me or which suits my convenience, I'm okay. But other times I'm not. Unfortunately, there will never be a situation where universally you can say which is this way or that way, right?
Right.
The dichotomy would continue to exist. Okay,
Yeah.
So I just thought I will leave it here because
Sure,
the nature of the beast makes it so hard. You can't really put it this way or that way.
Sure, thanks, Professor.
Sorry, I had a quick question. So we are not, as a company, we don't take much initiatives on the AI side for ourselves, but we provide this NLP called conversational AI services for clients, right? So I interesting to note your observation on the predictive part. So do you think in some time this judgment part also could generate data which can be plugged into models, and more and more it gets deterministic. The AI based development also getting deterministic in some time.
If I had the crystal ball kind of a question, I think, right? So no, I think the thing is definitely this itself has been a leap of a technology over a century. We have come to this point, and maybe this is the singularity that people talk about when there is a super intelligence that can do that. But clearly, it's not easy to see that on the roadmap today. Maybe in future that might be that judgment gradually comes there. And do, but I think in fact that's it's a good segue into a point where the AI has to also look at, and Professor Sadgopan alluded briefly to that, the whole philosophy part also, because we are getting into the whole question of like the trolley problem of the ethics, because eventually AI will have to do a judgment also, like a self-driving car which has no steering wheel or no driver on board there will have to make a decision in case of an unfortunate hypothetical scenario, whom to save. So clearly there will be a judgment that will have to come there, and at this point in time we have no clue as an industry, as a community of AI practitioners and researchers as to what will be the right thing to do. So I think your question is not that far-fetched as well, Ganeshan. It is something that will come there. Yeah. Okay, I see that Ajay and Bharat, you have hands as well. If it's okay with you, can I keep moving and we'll come back to you? I'll give you the first chance in the next one, so that you can probably take it, because I do want to make sure that we can wrap up also accordingly, and I have 2 more modules to go. So I'll keep going if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Thank you. So continuing the discussion there, as we saw, AI is getting everywhere, and it's also accelerating. Obviously, there is a lot of new use cases and new deployment scenarios are coming, but it's also time for a reality check. What we are seeing is that there is it's gradually coming to the point where it's taking a lot of time for development, designing, and deployment. I mean, only 11% of so Algorithmia, as some of you might know, it actually is one of the pioneers in really building AI algorithms as a service, and you can actually embed facial recognition by writing just few lines of code, for example. They said only 11% of the organizations can put a model into production within a week. So much we talk about architectural reuse, or we talk about code reuse and APIs, but we are not at that point there. And 64% or 2/3 of them take a month or longer. And in fact, a lot of time deployment is going into 2 to 6 months kind of a window. So that's one problem we are seeing. As a result of that, what is happening is, and as I already alluded in the first module, AI is not like a traditional software. It is more like human labor services rolled into that. So the time of data scientist is also getting used up every time there is a model in production, every time there is a model in deployment there. So the more the number of models, the more data science people you need, and the more time they are spending in the deployment time frame. And then, as if this is not enough, we are seeing yet another challenge there, that a lot of AI companies are not even AI in nature actually. Whatever machine learning we talk about, 40% of the European startups that were reviewed by this venture fund, they found that they were actually using no form of machine learning. So they were using human labor, and they were simply telling people that they were actually using AI, apparently because that raises the valuation in the investment market. So there is a lot of challenge in terms of the definitional clarity of what is an AI firm, and what constitutes AI, what are the boundaries of AI or not, is not very clear there. And then we are seeing alarmingly high failure rates. So Gartner says 85% of the projects will give wrong results. MIT, Sloan Management and BCG study said 70% of the companies are reporting minimal or literally no impact from their AI to their EBITDA, and even the EBITDA impact was considered very low. And VentureBeat gave a very startling revelation in one of the 2019 data, where they said 87% of the data science projects in fact never make it to the production. So there is so much of churn happening there of the pilots there, that and then even when we get to eventually see some production happening or some ROI, which itself goes to a very small population of project, what Deloitte has reported is that the average is only 4.3% for the project, which is the best ones, compared to only 0.2% for the beginning companies. So obviously there is a lot of challenges because there is so much of wastage or failures that are happening there, and the payback periods are anything from 1.2 to 1.6 years for the beginners there. So there are a lot of challenges obviously from this, and in fact I was looking at one very interesting pattern in the last 4-5 years. The AI global ROI happening in the first year of deployment. If we see this graph, it's very interesting. If you look at the blue bar here, which is they expected far more than expected ROI was accomplished, and the dark blue or the black one is more than expected. If you see, this together was almost 54% in 2015. By 2019 it had come down to 1/4 of it, or only 13%, and only about 82% was really as expected there. So clearly my guess, my read from this is really looking at it that they went into the whole deployment situation and they found there are a lot of challenges when it comes to data and scaling and some of the long tail that we talked about in the first section, that they are finding that they are not able to really get the right ROI. So clearly there is a lot left on the table in that process there. And then there are a lot of failures that we are seeing. For example, IBM Watson became most prominent after it beat the Jeopardy participants. But then IBM Health's Watson for oncology was cancelled after the unsafe treatment recommendations were happening. I talked about the chatbot there. Even things like Amazon was using AI for recruitment, and it turned out to be a misogynistic one. And then recently we also read about how Facebook has withdrawn the facial recognition. So there are clearly challenges there which are happening. And what we are seeing is most of the organizations are really in the early stages. Very few organizations have gone to the point where they are actually really getting to the point of AI first, as we will discuss in the third section. So how do we explain the whole thing? So in order to kind of explain what is really happening as a phenomena, what I am proposing is that I am actually calling them as cognitive chasms, and taking a leaf, as I was telling, from the crossing the chasm, because AI adoption has happened, but many of them are really reporting a significant drop off from the previous stages, and that's how I call them. Now, based on the initial survey of the literature, I have found that there are some 8 or 9 broad categories where I'm trying to cluster them together and see if there is a commonality of causality as to why they are happening, and then I am able to understand based on the research and validation, how can we bridge these gaps there. So I'll just briefly go through each one of them to kind of walk us through that. And this is a work in progress. So this is something which is in my preliminary list. I call them as hype, technology chasm, technology reality, and I'll just explain them. So the hype technology chasm is really all about from the popular fiction and from the Hollywood movies and from dystopian novels, we have a very exaggerated vision of reality that, hey, this is artificial intelligence, it will come and do this. I mean, people talk of things like Jetsons kind of a thing that we would be doing, and flying cars and all sort of a thing there. But reality of the technology is that it's still not there. And I think the case in point is the self-driving car. We have been, celebrated CEOs like Elon Musk of Tesla and others have been saying, we will have a full self-driving car, but every time it happens, every time the timeline seems to be shifting there. So the hype has been oversold in this area, but the reality of technology is that we are still not quite there. So that's the first chasm that I'm seeing, and that's probably more at a subject level, at a discipline level, at a field level, that as artificial intelligence, there is too much of hype happening, but the real technology is far behind it. So that's the first thing happening there. The second thing is that even if the technology is there, it doesn't mean that that can actually be deployed in reality. So for example, Elon Musk, one of the very famous tweets that he had done in 2018 was that excessive automation at Tesla was a mistake. Now, simply because you have a lot of automation available, technology is there, no doubt about it, but not everything has to have the level of technology sophistication. Maybe over technologifying something is really going to create more backlash and more challenges there. And he recognized that, and he said humans are underrated. So maybe there is a fine balance at which we need to stop and say we cannot go past it. And that may not be clear to everyone, and that may not be one single for every industry. but clearly there is a chasm where the technology over investment in that can actually lead to deflated ROI there. We are seeing some more examples of that. For example, like only 15% of the use cases leveraging AI will be used. So even though the technology is there, Gartner's data says that not everyone is going to start using simply because the technology is there. There is a kind of a reality check that's happening there. And even last year when Gartner in 2020, they said only 1 in CIOs who thought they would employ AI within the 12 months have actually achieved that. So clearly there was an exaggerated sense of what we can do with the technology, but didn't happen there. The next one is a very interesting one, which is the belief intent chasm. And there, technology is there, you have a sense of reality, and you still believe in that. In fact, this study came from UK, where they found in UK and the Nordics, 99% of those who surveyed believed that deep learning would transform their industry. So they actually believed it, but they were not willing to walk the talk. And the same survey found that only less than 1% of those CIOs and CTOs have deployed it. So there is so much of chasm between what they believe versus what their actual intent to really do that thing is. And when the intent happens there, that adoption has to happen, right? They believe that it's happening. So for example, and what we are seeing is that majority of the non-traditional or non-tech organizations are reporting the top 3 reasons are coming very consistently: lack of data science talent and skills, siloed data, because the data is like finance has their own data, marketing has own data, customer service has own data, and they don't talk to each other. And the lack of a suitable business case as to what problem should we solve, give it to the AI to solve it. Those are some of the most commonly cited causes behind inability to initiate the adoption effort. So that's the other chasm that we are seeing. Now, when the adoption has started and there is some kind of a pilot happening, this, as I was telling, 87% of the pilots are failing to go into production. So there is obviously a very big chasm happening there, because organizations are putting in so much of time, effort, and money, but it's not really happening there. And there are various data points that we are seeing from the industry in terms of how prominent this chasm is from pilot to production. The next one is from production to scaling. So let's say I have done the production and I'm able to now go live into that, and there is a use case that is happening there. How do I scale it across the organization? How do I really make sure that my entire organization, and not just one function of that, is really AI enabled? Or because then what's going to happen, I'm going to super optimize that one link of my value chain, but rest of my value chain is still going to be at a suboptimal, subpar level there. So that's again going to be the challenge that it's going to be there. And that's yet another challenge. We talked about that in the first segment. What are some of the reasons why scaling is a problem? Predominantly because of the long tail issue that we are seeing in the machine learning nature of problems. The scaling business is my favorite one, because that's where I see that there is the biggest chasm in my view, where the businesses are not able to quantify their ROI. So they are doing the scaling, they are going live, but they don't really fully understand how it is really going to have an impact on my business. Because if they cannot really quantify it, or in many cases, the quantification at best is at the bottom line level, which means they are able to improve the efficiency of marketing campaign, or they are able to improve the efficiency of XYZ, one of the sub processes, unless they are really able to take it up at the business level, which means in more ways than one, taking it from a bottom line to the top line and say, because of which my revenues went up 5%, or because of this, my market share went up 8%. Those, we are still dealing with an efficiency problem. And there's nothing wrong in AI implemented in efficiency. This is the pattern that we are seeing there. But the true value of AI is really going to be unlocked when we get to see that at the business level, which means we are really having a top line impact as opposed to the bottom line impact happening there. And then the last two chasms here, one of the challenges, as we are seeing more and more AI adoption happening, which is touching people's lives. Like, for example, if Netflix says, this is the movie for you, and you skip it, it's okay. It's not a big deal, even if it is a wrong recommendation. You will say, just ignore it. But if a AI software which is diagnosing a certain clinical condition is going to give some kind of a false positive. In fact, there's an article by one of the MIT researchers when she herself went through a few years of cancer treatment, and she came back from the treatment and she was herself an AI researcher. She found out that despite all the accomplishments in the computer vision and image recognition, and in the in if basically being able to diagnose or pre-diagnose cancer early, she found that there was a lot of reluctance among the doctors to actually embrace the technology. And in many cases, they simply didn't, they just kept it on the shelf and they said, we are not interested in that. And this is like last year paper actually that came out from the MIT researcher there. So there are a lot of predispositions, social apprehensions about how the AI is going to be done. I'll give another example. Geoffrey Hinton, who is one of the fathers of artificial intelligence and a Turing Award winner, in 2016 he gave a very revolutionary statement. He said we should stop training radiologists. Now that's again a very, it almost sounds like a clarion call actually, that we don't need radiologists. But if you ask an AI researcher, they believe very strongly in the merit of that statement, that the technology is better than what a human radiologist will ever have in terms of able to look at and do a radiologic diagnosis. But it again can cause a lot of challenges. Would you like to really be treated and given medical opinion by a robotic doctor who says you are fine or you are not fine? I think there are a lot of social apprehensions. So I think what we are going to see as it is going to come in a lot of life care and quality of life and safety critical missions, business elements, the business societal chasm is really going to play a big role in that, because eventually that is going to be a choke point where if the society really rejects it, then it's going to be very difficult. And it's very late in the cycle, it's very late in the funnel, because at that point in time we are not going to be in a position to really reverse how the original design of the AI was done. And that is, I think, a reason for us to kind of look at that condition beforehand and say, okay, how is if this has a societal touch point, what should be the way we should really be designing these systems? So those are, I think, some of the very interesting challenges there. And then another thing about an AI firm, as I already talked about, is that unlike a regular software company, an AI firm is really going to be in a 24/7 operational mode. There is no for example, you deliver it and then you kind of move on to something else. Here you deliver it and you keep monitoring it and you keep improving on it, and you are kind of forever in it. So there is that you need to have an operational mindset of how you are going to basically run that, as opposed to the behaviors that might be there, that you did an excellent job and now you are not even involved in that because you are doing something else now. So I think those are again the chasms that we will have to deal with. And I'm in the process of really validating some of these and looking at some of these perspectives there. And I would love to have your thought process again. After this slide, we'll take a reflection time break again and talk about what is it that you are really seeing. The last point on this section I want to offer is really the hype cycle of our AI, Gartner's hype cycle of 2021. And if you really see that while we have a lot of these buzzwords happening, things like synthetic data or smart robots or knowledge graph, digital ethics, deep learning, the feeling is that most of them are at least 2 to 5 years away. And in fact, at least a good 25% of them are 5 to 10 years away. So there is still a lot of, I'm not saying that this is a pipe dream, it is really happening there, but I think there is a lot of opportunity to basically see that this technology maturation is going to happen there. So with that, I will come to the reflection time here in terms of what cognitive chasms have you come across, etc. I see Professor Ram has raised the hand. So Professor Ram, if you would like to ask the question.
Yeah, Tathagat, wonderful presentation on the cognitive chasms.
Thank you.
The whole notion of chasms sort of presupposes that there's an adoption curve, the F. Rogers adoption curve.
Right.
Given that AI, as you rightly pointed out, is very different from traditional software and probably very different from products as we know them, what do you think could be how the adoption curve for AI could be radically different from the traditional adoption curves? Any thoughts on that? That we may actually see a very different adoption curve out that early majority and the late and all those standard terms. What's your sense on that?
Yeah, I think it's a what I'm seeing the pattern is that it's in some sense as long as it is in some kind of a like non-threatening way. So, for example, if somebody is doing something and it is seen as areas unsafe for people to do. So, for example, if we look at the robotic automation, it started in Toyota factories and a lot of other Japanese manufacturing plants in areas which was relatively unsafe or not a great place where humans wanted to work to begin with. So either it is a monotonous work, or it is unsafe work, or it is a very repetitive kind of a work, for example, which nobody wants to do. I'll take another example. We saw during the last holiday season that in the US, in California alone, 80,000 truck driver vacancies are there. People are simply not available there, for example. I was reading an article in Straits Times that in Singapore, the small city of Singapore, 538 junior lawyers have actually abandoned the profession altogether. Now, for a city like Singapore, it's a big deal because maybe 500 is probably 10% of their population of lawyers in the country. So we are seeing the situation where there are certain professions where human beings are either finding it very boring or monotonous or unsafe or repetitive to do. I think those are really very good use cases where we might be able to penetrate them, and simply because of the fact that we are not going to run into any human resistance or a change management, because there is nobody to do those things to begin with. And then really look at the forward and backward integration with some of the processes downstream. At least that's what my thought, Professor Ram. I'm not sure if you...
No, very interesting. I was also suggesting maybe the stages of adoption might be very different. Right. But that's something for offline discussion.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Professor. I know Ajay and Bharat, you had a question last time. If you'd like to go ahead, please do that.
Yes. Hi. Thank you. So I wanted to understand why the Microsoft chatbot was taken offline. So my question would be, AI is data driven with certain data points, right? So if these data points throughout a time period become invalid, something in history becomes invalid, let's say the negative comments for the Twitter bot were deleted, does the Twitter chatbot look back in retrospect and then correct itself? Does it have to be told to correct itself? And the same would apply to any other data point which gets invalidated over time. So is this AI technology capable of looking back at its data and correcting itself for future course?
So in case of Tay, as I understand, it was obviously in the open area. It was a unmoderated, without any parental guidance sort of a thing. And anybody and everybody, people actually were teaching it even wrong historical facts. I won't call them facts. They were teaching them wrong history. And it actually became a very racist who started misogynistic monologues actually. So that clearly showed that the way they designed that particular chatbot, that it took anything and everything that came its way and started making it as a part of its learning process itself, which in the retrospective, in the hindsight, maybe that was a wrong design there, because obviously you can programmatically make it a bounded problem instead of an unbounded problem. I think what they chose to do was that it became an unbounded problem, and that is the reason why it went into, so it was probably the nature of the beast along with the wrong design that probably landed it in that situation. At least that would be my guess, but I'm not like a subject matter expert on that.
No, so suppose if those negative comments were deleted and only the good politically correct one change its behavior.
Yeah, so I think this is like an iron wall analogy in that sense, right? That I basically delete history. I mean, like one light-hearted joke is that you cannot delete history from internet. Right? Somewhere or the other, it will be there. It's always there. But yes, I think you can definitely have a controlled environment where you are saying that 2 + 2 is 5, and if that's what you are teaching your algorithm from day one, then I think it is going to believe that 2 + 2 is 5, and it's probably going to mimic that answer at some point in time. Right, like the first chatbot, I remember when I was doing a master's, that was the Weizenbaum's ELIZA, which was a Lisp program, which was a chatbot Weizenbaum built, I think, in late 60s or early 60s, I think. It just had a series of things. It was a closed environment. It had a cold start problem. So there was no data or anything. whatever you do over a period of time, it was basically symbolic logic based chatbot. So it would start picking up things and it would start repeating it. It had no knowledge base. It was not accessing anything online, but it just would start repeating the same thing over a period of time. So I think clearly, depending on how you bound the problem, it could be used to in the benefit or in the negative way of that problem space, I think.
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Hi, Tathagat. Very interesting session. Bharat here.
Hi, Bharat. Hi.
It was not a question as such, but just an observation that when we ran through the initial slides where you mentioned that typically decisions that take very less time, I mean, AI is probably more suited there. But I just came across a thought that the ML-driven computer chess engines, right? So they practically replace like super intelligent thoughts of humans, which could take like 20 minutes sometimes for the app move. I mean, they can do it much faster. So I was just thinking that it doesn't necessarily have to be those simple mundane tasks. There are some really complex tasks, which as per the guideline is not a right fit, but here is one case that opposes the traditional thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very fair point, Bharat, you make there, that yeah, chess is a great example of how it takes often more than 1 second, but still. But I think if you really be fair, like if you look at Gary Kasparov's book on deep thinking, he talks about how in I think it was 97 when Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov. Essentially, it was using the raw power of computation. So if computationally it required 200 billion calculations of possible moves to happen, it was basically trying out all of them. It was not something, and that's when Gary Kasparov went into the human plus computer kind of a thinking actually. So the computer by itself was looking in a very brute force way of solving the problem, of looking at the entire computational space of that, without realizing that many of them would not be what humans would do. But if you look at what AlphaZero did actually, when it taught the chess to itself, when it played against itself and taught that, it was able to learn the moves that even humans would not consider actually. So I think there is an unknown element that we are seeing here. Time may not be the only criteria. I think Andrew Ng's statement was more like a very generic way of looking that, hey, if it is so simple, it is like you're not even thinking consciously about the problem, then maybe give it to the AI, it can do it. But yes, you're right. I think it's not a literal guidance.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. I think Shankdeep, you raised the hand.
Yes, Tathagat. So very interesting presentations. This cognitive chasms are really thought-provoking. So in the context of that, I was thinking about something called a pacing problem. So there's some theory around that technology changes exponentially in a society, but political change, economic and legal systems, they change incrementally and are always playing a catch-up,
Right.
thus creating challenges in regulation of emerging technologies. So in the context of that, and we have seen that in AI as well, like in say autonomous cars and all that, where the legal systems are not yet completely in place, right? So we're not sure who to hold accountable in case the AI fails and things like that, right? So do you see a cognitive chasm there as well in terms of the technological progress, especially in industry, versus the political systems and the legal systems and regulations and thinking of that sort?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point, Shankdeep, and that's how I would roughly cluster under the business societal chasm. In fact, I'll extend that and make a generic statement that, in fact, literally every digital economy business in the last 5 years, on the day of launch, was an illegal from most of the laws of the land. So Uber, when it got launched, there was illegal because, like for example, most of the DMVs or most of the transport departments do not allow people to charge money from each other unless you have a commercial license to ply the taxis. But Uber was doing, for example, that kind of a thing, or it disrupted the whole medallion system in New York City, where medallion was almost like $1 million value for the 50,000 medallions that were for taxi drivers. But Uber disrupted and democratized the whole model there. So I think that's a very fair point, that the legal system, the technology is changing at a pace, the social changes follow it, and then the political changes or the regulatory changes follow that. And sometimes they are just too strong and they hold the technology back, because like take the case of euthanasia. Euthanasia is a classic example of a technology that's been available for a quality of life right of a human being for ages, but then various social predispositions and the legal structures have prohibited it because it is illegal there. So I think that's a very fair point, and it has to be considered in the context of any GPT, like a general purpose technology like AI, in terms of the widespread adoption.
Yes, fair, good points. In fact, to extend that, maybe there is some kind of chasm. I cannot think through it properly, but you can maybe, right, for your research, in terms of the ethical angle of AI, right?
Correct.
There's some chasm that needs to be, bridged there as well.
Yes, yeah, no, I think the ethics and the whole part of responsible AI in terms of transparency, ethics, explainability, bias probably we can never eliminate fully. I think there is enough bias in humans as it is there, that we cannot blame only algorithms for that, but at least minimizing and being able to explain the extent of bias that is there in a certain prediction. All of them are, I think, a very important part. But thanks for the pointer. I have not explicitly looked at them as the chasm itself, but I think that's a key chasm to be looked at when it comes to the eventual deployment and a rollout at a societal level, in terms of how, like for example, the same technology may be legal in one country and illegal in another country, simply because of how the social predispositions or the social norms are, and also the laws of the land. But thanks, Shangdeep.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Krishnan, you raised a hand. Do you have a question?
I had a question, comment.
Yes.
The once again, these chasms that you presented are good ones. Just wondering that these chasms don't seem to be AI specific. They seem to apply to any technology. Do you want to look at chasms which are more like this last point which you made, for example, is very specific to AI? So just a thought or a question to you.
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting one. I had not thought of if they are fairly generic enough or very AI specific. I mean, I started looking at it. One of the goals that I have is, can I really look at it and create a grounded theory of some of these general purpose technology changes in the context of societal adoption there? Maybe AI is a very narrow specific use case in that, but maybe some of them might have an applicability beyond that for other general purpose technologies as well. I'll definitely look into that. Thanks for the pointer, Krishnan. Okay, I think we'll keep going. We'll go to the next segment there, and the last segment of it. So I'll take about 20-25 minutes and talk through some of them, and we can have more Q&A after that. So the third one that I want to talk about is really on the AI first phenomena that we have started to see in the last 5 years. And it's still fairly new phenomena, but this was a very interesting conversation that came in one of the interviews that Technology Review did with Andrew Ng, where he said, Andrew Ng actually gave a very contrarian answer to that. That's the reason it's important to it's interesting at least. He said, I'm sure people frequently ask you, how do I build an AI first business? What do you usually say? And Andrew Ng said, I usually say, don't do that. Because if I go to a team and say, hey, everyone, please be AI first, that tends to focus on the team on technology, which might be great for a research lab, but in terms of how I execute the business, I tend to be customer-led or mission-led and almost never technology-led. I think that's a great reminder of what is wrong with the technology-driven businesses, and not just in AI. Like in Bangalore, I've been very active with the startup ecosystem. A lot of times, a majority of times, we see techies come together and do a startup, and then they say, I have built this solution, and then you ask, okay, what is the problem you are really solving? And they don't know really. So it is like what I call a solution in search of a problem syndrome. So you have a solution, but you don't know what problem it is solving there. I think we have seen with AI also some of those things which are interesting. Some people even call them as the toys, because like a chess playing toy or a Jeopardy playing toy. But then what is really the impact to the business? How does, in the impact, at least in the context of a business driver, how does really AI play the role? So that is the third part of it, where how do you really look at an AI first firm? So I'll try to describe it again. I built some constructs on this phenomena of AI first, and this is a very this is not the perfect definition, but this is how I'm evolving my thinking around it, which is like an AI first firm is really a firm that continuously assists and augments human judgment in decision making by delivering socially acceptable and appropriately explainable prediction solutions by data driven learning. So of course a lot of words and jargon thrown into that, but the key thing there is that it is not something like I talked about the fact that 40% of the European startups that called themselves as AI were not even using machine learning. So there is no learning component in them at all. Their software would be either driven by human beings. It's almost like the mechanical Turk that was there in 18th century, or there is no learning. So every time you start the software, it would start at exactly the same place, and there is no way to really see whether there is any improvement happening or not. So I'm trying to specify, looking at all this data, looking at the chasms, looking at the industry data and research data, and seeing, is there a way that we can draw the boundary around and say that, hey, this is what really constitutes an AI first firm, and this is not because of so and so reasons. So that I'm trying to specify, and I've identified a set of propositions that collectively help us describe what is really an AI first firm. And I would like to now present it to you for your examination. The first one I call as the cognitive proposition. I'll skip the text, only the blue box I will read because in the interest of time. The first thing I want to, I believe is important is that the AI first firms, they leverage cognitive capital for the competitive advantage. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me just do the voiceover on that. If we look at last 200 years of industrial revolutions, the previous industrial era firms, they either exploited natural resources. So for example, steam or coal or water, or dynamite as a power, for example, or human and animal labor. So it was obviously farm labor, or it is like transportation, animals, and so on. Or more recently in the last 50 to 70 years, financial capital. So whether it is investment firms or VC firms or private equity, for example, so you are to create the value for the firm. So that's what we saw typically, these three big buckets. But an AI first firms doesn't do any of them. It doesn't really require the natural resources. Well, I'll take that with a caveat, because some people may say that it still requires computing power and data center and electricity, but that is a common denominator for anyone. So I will ignore it for now, because the primary source of primary resource that it is using is neither natural resource nor human or animal labor, and nor even financial capital in order to create value for the firm. What it instead is using is really computational power of the cognitive technologies, and that it is using to essentially create and capture and deliver powerful insights. And these insights are then enabling the firm to improve its decision-making capability to manage the resources and processes better. So that's how I would look at the linkages of these together. And I'm just describing them by calling all this as the cognitive capital of a firm, instead of a financial capital, or instead of a plant and machinery, or instead of a raw material. This is really what is driving a AI first firm, and that I call as the cognitive proposition, which means that any firm that feels or wants to call itself as an AI driven firm, the first thing is, what is the primary source of your value creation? If it is not cognitive capital, then probably, even if it is, let's say it is in the business of labeling data for supervised learning, or let us say it is in some other peripheral part of the AI ecosystem, we will not want to call it as an AI first firm, as much as, for example, a catering firm which is delivering food to a hospital doesn't become a healthcare firm, right? It still remains as a catering firm. It doesn't become a healthcare firm. So similarly, any firm which is in the business of, let's say, hand labeling the data for training in supervised learning, even if it is doing for an AI firm, it doesn't become an AI firm. So I think that distinction should become clear with the cognitive capital there. The next one is the purpose proposition. In the purpose proposition, what I'm proposing is that the AI firms prioritize solving business critical problems and not merely adopt AI technologies for its sake. So what I'm saying essentially is that the core purpose of a firm still remains business, still remains why it is there in the first place, and not gets replaced by simply because there is a new algorithm on the block and we should start using it. So I think using technology for the sake of technology, I might be a research lab and I'm interested in doing it. That's a different use case. But if I am a firm, if I'm operating for purpose as a business enterprise, then I'm still looking at solving my business critical problems. And if that requires me to use a certain technology, which was latest one or 5 years back one, then so be it. But I'm basically saying that the technology by itself is not the first class citizen. The first class citizen still remains the business problems that we are going to solve, even if it's an AI first firm. So if you look at, for example, a Google is not there simply because it has to improve the algorithms. A Google is there to serve the customers, whether it is advertisers, whether it is the various products it is serving, or a YouTube, for example, or a Netflix, for example. Netflix is a great example where they had $1 million contest to basically come up with the algorithm to improve the recommendation efficiency. But even after they paid $1 million to the winning team, but they did not use the algorithm because, for one, that algorithm was built around the fact when it was still into the blockbuster kind of a business and not in the streaming business. So it was really not the right one. But simply because they had an algorithm and technology, they didn't start using it. They still focused on what was right for the business as opposed to what the technology was saying. So the purpose, in my view, is very important, why we are using that. The third thing is social proposition. And we talked about some of those things. And I think, Shankdeep, you raised some of the points from a social fitment and legal acceptance point of view as well. My point is that AI first firms implement AI solutions with a social good angle and societal acceptance first mindset. So they are not saying that, hey, simply because we have the facial recognition technology, let's go and do that. In fact, some of you who have been observing some of the AI material might also know that some prominent companies have actually, the developers have come en masse and they have forced their companies not to work on technologies that are not very well proven, like the facial recognition, because they tend to have inherent bias in them, which is not right for the human beings, which is not right for the societies. So that is how I see, and I'm just taking a pole position there and saying that, hey, this has to be the motto for the AI first company, and not simply because of profit maximization, but really looking at a social fitment part of it. The fourth one is the human proposition, where I'm proposing that the AI first firms embrace technology not to replace people from their jobs, as is widely feared and reported, but really to augment people capabilities. So that's a very clear pattern. Again, we are seeing that there are companies that are clearly seeing that, hey, I'm not here to really remove people, because this, for 200 years, starting with the first industrial revolution, we have seen the Luddite movement was all around the social backlash or the people backlash or worker backlash really against the new technology. And that often makes the whole adoption cycles much longer, much more difficult. So the AI first firms recognize that conflict is not the right way, but coexistence is really the right way. And the way they achieve that is really looking at how can we embrace technology to augment the capabilities. In fact, in the industry, some people have stopped calling AI as artificial intelligence. They are calling it as augmented intelligence, which is like, it is really augmenting the intelligence of the human beings by providing them better insights. The next one is an experimental mindset or an experiment proposition. The key point here is that AI first firms are constantly leveraging experiments as the source of organizational learning. So instead of relying on the hierarchy and titles and tenures and experience as a proxy for competencies and expertise, what they are saying, which may or may not be wrong by itself, but given the nature of changes, given the nature of transdisciplinary learning and subject matters, no one person can be an authority on any given area. But on the other hand, a good well-designed AI system can actually come up with a much better source of organizational learning rather than relying on one individual alone. And even if we rely on one individual alone, it may be difficult beyond a point to really replicate that ability for a non-trivial firm. So an AI-first firm really seeks to do experimentation as a way of experimentation is the new normal. So they're always experimenting it, and through well-designed scientific and replicable experiments, they are constantly culling out the insights, which then become the source for organizational learning. And these insights are then really used as the primary input and the enabler of decision making. So the decision making is not really simply because there is a designated general manager of the plant who is paid to make the decisions, but the decisions are really coming in a very objective fashion. Now again, there is a we have to take it with a pinch of salt. Sometimes a totally data-driven approach can be a very wrong approach because it totally misses the context there. So I'm not saying that that is the only source of decision making, but what I'm saying is that that is the primary input and the enabler of that. We might from time to time, from context to context, still and always will need human element in that one. But primarily, depending on the kind of problem we are solving, the insights are more driven by, insights are really driving more and more of the organizational decision making in an AI first firm. Then there is this whole element of learning, which is really a key part of an AI first firm, which is like, it is in a constant learning loop in terms of why are we here, why are we doing in the first place. In some sense, it is a double loop of learning, not just really a correctional feedback, but even a sort of an existential question and saying, well, is this really the right business we should be in? And that question is not being answered by the hunch alone or by somebody's gut feeling alone, but really coming from the data and saying, hey, this experiment is leading us to the insight that this is an opportunity for us. This is where the underserved markets are. Let's go and really solve that problem. So that is how AI first firms are really willing to pivot their position and say that how do we really go and look at the opportunities there. And then once they have understood the learning part of it, they also have to be very nimble on their feet. They have to be in a position to have a very fluid kind of a DNA where the change management mechanisms are available at the back end call, and they are able to essentially trigger the change management to stay aligned with the dynamic market. So if I'm in a market which changes, let us say every year, I should be able to internally rewire and match the impedance between the external pace of change and the internal pace of change. But if I am in a market which changes every month, for example, then I have to be in a position to change and really rewire myself, which essentially means that I'm talking about things like organization structure, capabilities, product design, operational processes, human skills, the whole OD part I'm putting here actually in terms of the organization design part of it, including the last point, which is very key in terms of really not just tweaking the business strategy and the business model, but even be willing to go back and change, like the hypothetical thought question, Professor Ajay Agrawal's question I was posing earlier. What happens if when the prediction accuracy goes high? Are you going to fundamentally change your business model? Even if you want to change the business model, an AI first firm needs to have a very agile way of doing it. So the ideas like holacracy or the ideas like lean startup or the ideas like agile development will be needed at the back end to be compatible with the pace of change. Otherwise, at the outer side we are changing, but internally we remain the same, and that may not be, in my view, the AI first firm. It just has an AI veneer. It doesn't really have the AI at the core, for that matter. The last one or two, and then I'll just stop here after that. The operations proposition is the one. I think it's a very important one, and kind of brings the technology play that they have to really be operating at a zero or a near zero marginal cost. And this is an extension from the digital economy itself, that is the difference between a traditional resource-led economy to a digital economy, that we are getting to a more near zero marginal cost or transaction cost of transactions being zero there. That I think is a very key part of it, because the more today, like the example I was giving, the model doesn't seem to lend itself very well, because today if you have a lot of For example, data science, the more models you deploy in the field, the more data scientists you need there. That is not a zero marginal cost. It's actually growing linearly almost, or at a certain positive rate there. But an AI first firm should really be able to get to the point where it is able to scale up. It's able to scale up the operations or the capabilities at near zero marginal cost. So I think that's going to have a little more futuristic angle probably, but I think that goes in hand with what we are discussing here. And then in line with my thinking right now, I'm looking at other candidate propositions and trying to understand and cull out data in terms of saying what is the role of technology. For example, are they really looking at more experimental or the moonshot kind of technologies, or are they settling for a more stable technologies? What is the role of AI platforms really in an AI first firm? Is it all platform driven approach so that we are able to really look at more smart services and smart ways of smart business models, for example? Does it have to be an API based architecture only, or does it really lend itself to other kind of architectures also? What about the ecosystems, or I want to call them as cognitive ecosystems? So for example, in a Web3 kind of a architecture where we have smart contracts between companies, we might see a situation where, for example, a supplier and a buyer, their AI systems are actually doing a cartelization. In fact, that case is expected. I think there is a forecast that Gartner did that by 2023, we are going to get the first lawsuit where the two AI systems have collusion and they are actually creating a nexus or even a cartel, actually a price cartel, for example. Now, these seem like science fiction fantasies, but these are becoming more and more real by the day. So what is really the guiding behavior of those AI first firms in terms of cognitive ecosystems and where the agents are collaborating or colluding? What about the business models, design, and then the product development? So these are some of the things. I'll just again pause here. I think I see some hands here, so we can have some questions here. Professor Ram, you raised the hand.
Yes, Tathagat, very interesting propositions. They're almost like principles, right?
Okay.
AI first principles. But one question, and that is, the very term AI first denotes this, all that matters is AI. So it might be interesting considering principles or propositions
Right.
that also relate to the non-cognitive element. If much of cognition is going to be AI enabled or AI driven, then what happens to the affective, the feeling side? So what does an AI first firm do in terms of the human side of it? To have some stand over there, that it has a relationship, a harmonious relationship with the affective feeling. If there is a feeling economy, that will be left largely to humans.
Right.
So that would be one. And the second one would be also to take a stand on this whole power imbalance, the control aspect of it, that there be some principles that, at some level suggest that an AI first firm respects the power boundaries or control boundaries. So something along those lines, worth thinking about.
Got it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I have not explicitly looked into that as yet, but I've noted them. I'll look into that. Thanks. Krishnan, you raise a hand.
Sorry, I had actually not lowered my hand.
Okay.
But I mean, just one fundamental thing, that is the AI still doesn't have sort of empathy built into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so AI first businesses, by definition, means empathy-less businesses, which I find terrible.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's what Professor Ram was also alluding to. I think the whole effective computing context, in terms of being conscious and being at least being cognizant of the emotions and being aware. Like empathy is obviously one of the advanced emotions there. So yeah, I think that makes sense. Otherwise, it's like a cold steel kind of a thing, which is just making mechanical decisions without really looking at the context and the emotional aspect of it. Is that what you are alluding to?
Tathagat Bharat here. In fact, to the point Krishnan just mentioned, I have an actual example where one of our clients, US-based premium banking service that
Yeah.
caters typically to the higher income group, they rejected the concept of chatbot in banks, although it's picking up everywhere, just because they felt they don't want their customers to be talking to a machine. And they are still like relying on the concept of personal bankers and with that empathy, touch of empathy. So just to Krishnan's point, yeah, I mean, some firms are conscious of that and are hence not really onboarded to this AI first.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, Bharat. And in fact, one research paper I was reading where the author actually has been a stand-up comedian for last 30 years, and he has actually now built his own chatbot business. So he's bringing the elements of what makes a stand-up comedy appealing to the people. And his research is very well written paper where he has talked about actually creating a spontaneous humor, which is a very contextual humor in the chatbots. And that is, he's saying that it is actually, so literally when you say, oh, I'm not well, it actually will try to create a joke. It's almost like an impro kind of a thing, which actually seems to be creating the impression that you are talking to a fully sentient machine. You know it's a chatbot, but you still have really better disposition towards it. So there are some interesting work happening in some of those areas. But you are right. It's almost like first time 20 years back when I would have spoken to an IVR machine, which was a very depressing feeling, talking to an IVR. Today, I think it's becoming even more widespread, I think.
Right. And just to add, the concept of hybrid chats, that's why it's taking over, where the AI component of it essentially takes some info, but when it senses that the other party is not really happy, it just switches over automatically to a human. So I think that is also catching up big time, the hybrid model.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, thanks, Bharat. Yeah. Purnima, you have a question?
Yeah, Tathagat sir, good afternoon. Quick question. What is the purpose of the existence of the AI first firm, according to you? If you could just outline that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, Purnima. I think the reason I got intrigued by this was 2 or 3 phenomena happening. What is happening is, one is obviously there is a lot of snake oil in terms of everybody declaring themselves as an AI firm. And in that process, what is happening is we really don't know what is a right classification, what is the right definition of what constitutes AI and what doesn't constitute an AI firm there. Now, why is that even important there? If $15 trillion of economic value is to be created, which essentially means that a lot of companies of today will have to get to the finish line. They will have to get to the point where they can become an AI company. What kind of a change management frameworks can we give them? What kind of a kit can we give them? What kind of a guidance can we give them to really draw the baseline and say, this is where you are, this is the starting line, and by the way, this is the finish line, this is how success will look like to you. So to me, being able to specify AI first is an equivalent of saying that this is what success will look like to you. If you are really doing these n number of things there, then you are very well positioned to really look at yourself being able to leverage the AI capabilities. But if you are not doing it, then chances are that you are leaving something on the table. So it actually kind of becomes some kind of a self-audit or some kind of an assessment or some kind of a maturation model, if you will, which allows people to look at whether I'm really an AI firm or not.
Right. I think that's an important point to make upfront, actually, because like what we teach in marketing is why does a business really exist? And that's to serve customer needs. And ultimately, the aim is not just to manipulate data for for the firm's growth per se,
Correct.
but to help customers basically serve their needs and to actually discover also what they don't know themselves may be a need, and to help improve humanity and the state of existence. And it really helps, makes me question now in the broader question of sustainability, of climate change. There'll be so many threats. And how do we leverage the new technologies to continue to improve the quality of life of humanity per se? And if AI can play an important role in that, that's an important aspect then that we should be focusing on, but not at the cost of manipulation of people. So that's an important ethical question we need to answer.
Fairly, I totally agree with you. Thanks, Purnima.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll do one thing. I have just one last recap slide, and then I will stop sharing. And then if we have time, we can have some more Q&A. Sorry, you have a question, Professor Ram?
Right. I wonder if I could just do a quick. I think there is concern about the term AI first. There seems to be, and I think the concern is about this, what you mentioned, cold steel that doesn't take into account human beings and so on. I'm wondering if the term is putting off participants here, and very likely, and if terms like AI best firms, if that's a better term. Just what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think
AI first
is probably becoming more like a marketing. It has the danger of at least being perceived as a very ruthless in its pursuit kind of a enterprise, I think. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
I'll definitely think on what could be a better way to really position it and not look at it from a like a very one-sided kind of a view there. Yeah.
Because in some ways you're looking at perhaps the most appropriate applications of AI, right? And the best use of AI is.
That's right.
In fact, can I? Sorry, I don't know whether this is okay with you, Tatagat, but can I respond to?
Please
can I respond to that? I just want to riff off what the professor said.
Right.
So in effect, are you saying AI first with respect to the technology, strategy of the firm, and not really the entire firm? I mean, the entire strategy. Like everywhere else, people first, but technology. We are not cloud first. We are not API first. We are AI first. Is that what you're referring
to? Yeah. So if you were asking me, Krishna, no, I think that, I mean, even I have at times looked at even the question of, like, let's say you are in the lighting company. You don't call yourself as an electricity company. Just because you use electricity doesn't make you as an electricity company. You call yourself as a lighting company, or you call yourself as a home furnishings company or something else, right? So I think why is that we have an obsession with using AI as a prefix to that one? What is the real need for us to do that? I think there is a deeper question. Definitely, even I am at the crossroads to think about it. But notwithstanding that one, Krishnan, to your point, AI first definitely seems to have the connotation of being a very tech-heavy kind of a name, where you are kind of promoting that, hey, it's a very technology kind of a thing there, rather than kind of saying that it could be something else, for example. So whether that's the right positioning, it does definitely put people at large on the defensive. We're saying, hey, does it really?
No, Tatagat, sorry. Just to, I'm saying you can still say AI first, but as long as you say it's AI first, but I'm only referring to the technology strategy of the company.
Okay, understood.
You could still say AI first. Nobody will have an issue with it. But I'm just asking, is that how you want to position it, or no? I think AI is so much larger than just technology.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely positioning it as a business enabler and not as a technology alone. It's as a business enabler, and I want to see what is the right fitment of that, like any other technology. In the context, see, any technology, the moment it got regulated socially and regulated by law, it has had a blockbuster growth. Look at electricity. The moment we standardized on the electricity and saying this is 220 volt, we standardized on the connectors, we standardized on all the safety mechanisms, the usage became widespread there. So I think the same kind of a thing, how do we really look at quote unquote regulating AI as a technology to the point that it can really replicate itself well? And if AI first stands in the way of it being perceived as, hey, we are really pursuing AI for the cause of pursuing AI, then I think it could have a repercussions on that.
So Tatagat, I think it is not so much a positioning issue, but it is a purpose issue. In fact, some time back you used the word augmented intelligence. So if you can really look at, like Professor Purnima Bhatnagar talked about, if you can see that empowering and enabling the human kind, then it would be more acceptable. And if that's what is your purpose, that should come in the articulation as well, rather than just worried about the positioning, in my mind.
Got it. Yeah. No, purpose obviously has to precede the positioning. Purpose is paramount, I think, in terms of why are we even doing it, and then I can my positioning can actually be derived from the purpose once it is more clear. So yeah, agree with you. Thanks, Ara. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll just go to the last slide, and then if we have any questions, we can do it. Otherwise, we can wrap up. So just to recap here. If I look at the whole landscape of AI as technologies, I think there is infinite amount of opportunities and possibilities for a firm to look at how they can harness the power of AI. But obviously, it's a very relatively new state of adoption, and it's not very clear pattern of what really is successful. People are still groping in the dark and saying, okay, maybe if I hire PhD students with statistics, maybe that will work. Maybe if I have product managers, it will work. But there are a lot of deeper issues to be seen than just the AI veneer that we are seeing in the industry. The firms need to obviously watch out for the cognitive chasms. I think that's an important thing, because these are, in my view, the drop-off cliffs where they are losing the stream, they are losing the momentum, they are losing the time and effort and money, and more importantly, the opportunity. Because it's becoming wide, it's very fast going to become an enabler, a value differentiator for the businesses. And they need to also think of what they would like to really, what are some of the tenets of being an AI first firm, by what are those first principles approach, rather than simply looking at adopting some technology and saying, hey, we use GPT-3 or we use something else, and hence we are an AI firm. I think that itself may not be. In fact, the last point I want to add is Professor Andrew Ng, he very nicely said in a course that as much as simply by having a website, not every company became an internet company, right? An internet company has a very different connotation than simply having a website or an app. Similarly, an AI company just using, for example, one technology doesn't really become an AI technology. We expect more to it. We expect some of the things I talked about in terms of data or insights or learning or experimentation as the first principle. So I think that approach is what I'm proposing in this one. So I'll stop sharing now. And thanks once again. Thanks for all your questions and inputs there. We have few minutes, but I see Professor Sadgopan on the video. So, sir, would you like to add something?
I think you did an excellent job. So what I was particularly happy was that you had proposed a series of things. I think that is possibly a nice way to look at it. And yes, particularly people like us, because we are the techies. So, and we end up, a lot of people keep asking for advice, etc. So we start giving lots of advice, which possibly might put the technology at the driver's seat. But I think technology can be at the driver's seat, but there must be backseat driving from the business, because we should not be allowed to drive the car wherever we want. I think the car should have, I think purpose must be the one which guides the whole thing. So I think that you brought a lot of sanity to the whole thing. So I'm glad.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I wish you good luck in your research. So I think this is extremely contemporary. And luckily, this is one area where the research which you do sitting in India can actually be universally applicable.
That's right.
There are not many areas where, you do from one region, okay, but this is something where everybody is kind of groping in the dark. So I think good. So I look forward to some exciting research coming out of you.
Sure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? We have few minutes, so in case we have, otherwise we can wrap up sooner. Yes, Professor Ram.
Right. Tathagat, I just want to, taking that last comment from Professor Sadgopan and the other comments in terms of purpose, let's say you were to take that, the purpose is enable that kind of healthy relationship between AI, business, society, and so on, all the stakeholders, right, of AI. So what would be the connecting theme through all these three segments? The first one was on economics of AI. The second was cognitive chasms. The third is this. So what would tie those three segments together into a kind of a coherent whole that achieves that purpose? What's your thought on that?
I think I definitely see an opportunity. I see a gap there because the technology has grown and it has suddenly become more powerful. in the last few years, whereas the social attitudes and even the business readiness is behind it. If there is a way we are able to club it together and we are able to describe it as a framework, it could be a strategic change management framework, for example, which really allows a business to look at it and say, okay, this is a new tool, and all of us are going through this cognitive revolution at the same time. But using this toolkit, using this strategic management framework, I have an opportunity to look at the change holistically. Otherwise, I would look at technology first. I may ignore social context, and I might go off the rail. Is there an opportunity for us to provide that to the practitioners? Is there an opportunity for us to provide that to the businesses that adds the value, eliminates some of the guesswork, eliminates some of the chasms that we are seeing by providing them some kind of a guidance on crossing those chasms? I think that way it could serve as a strategic change management framework. At least that's how I would see Professor Ram.
Interesting. I'm wondering if it can be expanded to even more broadly to this is an AI-enabled business strategy. So the overarching theme, within which part of that is change management, which is the cognitive chasms, right? Overcoming those chasms, which is the change management component of the business strategy. That's the implementation. Then the economic side is the economic side of the strategy, right? The cost effectiveness. And then your principles are really almost the drivers of that strategy. I'm wondering if there's some way to make it even bigger than just change management as a theme. Something to consider.
Okay.
I don't know. Considering the impact, would the societal impact be more predominant than economic? I'm just proposing to what Professor Ram talked about, which is driver, because the impact on an individual, what you looked at Jahan lives and livelihood part, I think you just need to look at a social dimension or societal dimension.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that'll be a very important one.
Sure.
The ESG dimension.
Sure, thanks. Okay, thanks. I think we're almost at the hour. So, Professor Sadgopan, Professor Ram is my guide as well. So,
very nice. Very nice to know Professor Ram. Okay, sometime we will kind of catch up. So
yes, very much so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really thankful, Professor Ram, you took time out for attending the workshop. But thanks once again for, I know afternoon is really difficult, but thanks for patiently being with me the last couple of hours. I hope it was helpful. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn offline and look forward to connecting with you. Over to you, Professor Sadgopan.
Okay, thank you, Tathagat. Tathagat, the proof of the pudding is in eating. So you kept everyone actually not sleeping from 2 to 4 p.m. post-lunch. Okay, that speaks volume of your engaging talk. Okay, so thank you so much. And I'm sure you all will agree and giving him a kind of nice set of claps. Thank you. And I think it's good, sir, that the pre-conference day has been a fairly hectic, and I think all the sessions were exceptionally good. And all of them we could start on time, and we're actually ending on time. Yes. And I think Haragopal, you will have the last word.
No, so I think it's interesting that we have excellent participation. This only gives us a lot more excitement for the next 2 days. This is only the warm-up, so to say. So please do join us tomorrow and day after. We have a good spread of sessions and engaging as they would be, and super excited. And thanks once again to all the panelists as well as the participants. Thanks very much, Professor, for
so thank you. See you at 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.